Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.38, Canada and Carolina. For the last 3 episodes, we have spent our time looking at the process and response to the Declaration of Independence. Although it was, unquestionably, a critical moment in our story, by itself it was nothing more than words on paper. Anybody can declare their independence from anything that they want. Just because you say the words does not make them true. So with the colonies now openly stating that they were independent from Great Britain, the next step was for them to back up their newfound status in the field. The battle, or should I say battles, that are going to so completely define the summer campaign season of 1776 is going to be the British invasion of New York. We are going to be spending some very significant time with Washington in New York. So, for now, we are going to put him aside until the end of today. First, I want to take a broader view of what is happening militarily in places other than New York. So, today we are going to travel first to Canada, and then we are going to drop back down to the south. With our secondary theaters wrapped up, next week we will be ready to move into Washington's defense of New York. I had alluded to the fact that the situation in Canada was not going great back in episode 4.35, but I really had just left it at that. However, now I want to double back to Canada and see what is actually going on there. The last time that we had left Canada, things were not exactly going great. Benedict Arnold was recovering from being shot. Richard Montgomery had died outside of Quebec. Despite his wounds, Benedict Arnold managed to pull the American army back, but their consolation prize was having to endure a Canadian winter. Now, just a quick note on the terminology going forward. I'm going to start using the term American Army more frequently. I don't love it, and it is not exactly correct. There were, after all, Americans who were most assuredly against the Whig cause. However, I need a term to differentiate the armies. I am not a big fan of either the Whig Army or the Patriot Army, as both terms can mean multiple things. To continue and refer to this as the Rebel Army also seems to downplay the scope of the situation. The Continental Army is a good choice, but the problem with the Continental Army is that it ignores all those militia companies that were not part of the Continental Army. These are the irregular troops who we are going to be talking much about, especially as it pertains to the South. So, with no perfect choice, I have decided that the American Army in this case is the one that I will go with. So, just know, I am very aware that not all Americans supported the Whig cause, but that it is the term that we will be using to differentiate it from the British Army. As the spring of 1776 began, there was hope that Arnold and company might be able to regroup and, as the plan had called for the year before, capture Quebec. The Americans still faced a very real threat of the British coming up the St. Lawrence and moving through the river systems of the Northeast. Should that have become a reality, it would have given them the opportunity to completely cut off and isolate New England from the southern colonies. The job of capturing Quebec and blockading the British fell into the hands of John Thomas. By all accounts, Thomas was a completely capable officer. However, don't worry about memorizing that name. Thomas arrived in the American camp on May 1st, where he would remain until June 2nd, when he died of smallpox. His replacement was David Wooster, who unfortunately would not prove up to the task. Shortly after Thomas arrived, during that short period prior to his death, so did the British reinforcements, having finally managed to get their ships through the icy, although not completely frozen St. Lawrence. Reaching Quebec on May 6, the fleet just so happened to get there on the day that Guy Carleton decided to venture out with his troops to see what the American army was up to. Recall that the American forces, following the loss at the end of the year, moved just a mile or so from Quebec, where they would hunker down. From January to May, everybody just nervously stuck around without any real action. This was to the considerable annoyance of many, who were very curious as to why Carleton was just hanging out and not evicting the remaining American army. The Americans, having little interest in fighting, made a hasty retreat, leaving their artillery and those who were too injured to travel behind. With more than 8,000 reinforcements having now arrived, Carleton ordered the British to move out and start the process of chasing the Americans south, under the command of the recently arrived General John Burgoyne. For the Americans, it was imperative that they do something, anything really, to stop the advance of the British. Should Burgoyne and Company be allowed to succeed, then not just Canada, but all of New England could find itself in very real danger. The Americans took up a position at Sorel, located some 40 miles north of Montreal. The British took up their positions 30 miles further north at Trois-Rivières. Trois-Rivières is located roughly halfway between Quebec and Montreal, just a little ways south of Batiscan, which you may remember was Montcalm's fallback position during the French and Indian War, should Quebec have fallen. The American forces had originally been located further to the north at Deschambault, just to the south of Quebec. Although it was a more defensible position due to the local geography, when it became clear that the British were on the move, Wooster decided to move the army further upriver to that position at Sorel, as it would potentially be an easier location to mobilize and, if need be, to evacuate Canada from, should things go sideways. This all came to the very considerable chagrin of Benedict Arnold, who was down in Montreal. What those spring months brought for Arnold was a disorganized mess. During a time that he was visited by a delegation from Congress, one that included Benjamin Franklin, Arnold found himself constantly having to fend off attacks, while living under the fear that the local population would jump at the opportunity to eject the occupying Americans. At the same time, what the commissioners saw was an army that was not just lacking in manpower, but was ill-equipped, had their clothing in tatters, was sick, and desperately wanting for food. Arnold would spend the next several weeks writing to just about anybody who would listen about the desperate state of the army as the summer approached. Arnold, although assuming command in Montreal, was likewise busy waiting for New Hampshire attorney, and now Brigadier General, John Sullivan to arrive. Sullivan was nothing if not very confident in his own abilities, and he was convinced that with a few bold strokes, he would be able to turn around a clearly faltering Canadian campaign. Upon arriving at Sorel, Sullivan had gotten intelligence that there were only 800 or so British troops at Trois-Rivières. He ordered General William Thompson to assemble an army of some 2,000 men to march off and dispatch with a smaller British detachment. With his orders in hand, Thompson set out to carry those orders and lead the men north to Trois-Rivières. If Sullivan was hoping that his bold stroke would turn around the campaign, others, such as Arnold, were really hoping at this point that the American forces would manage to hold their position in Montreal. The attack by Thompson on June 8th was doomed from the very beginning. Unbeknownst to him, the British Army had significantly grown its ranks since that first ship of reinforcements had arrived. Now, critically, these reinforcements were not exclusively British soldiers. A good number of them had actually come from Brunswick. The Americans had, for a while now, been busily engaging in rumor-mongering over the British, sending German mercenaries across the Atlantic to attack them. It was no longer mere rumors, as the Germans were now indeed arriving to help in the fighting. Unlike what Sullivan had prepared for, there was not just 800 British troops ready to face Thompson when he arrived. In fact, rather than encountering a small British detachment, Thompson and his 2,000 troops ran headlong into a British army that now had some 6,000 in its ranks. The battle was brutal. The Americans suffered over 400 casualties, as compared to just around a dozen or so for the British. Thompson was killed in the fighting. The Battle of Trois-Rivières was easily the biggest battle during the spring in Canada. However, all along the St. Lawrence, American forces faced hard conditions. Native American attacks had taken their toll, and although much smaller in scope than the engagements at Trois-Rivières, the spring campaign of Canada brought nothing but death and suffering for the Americans. To add insult to injury, if it wasn't warriors and soldiers killing them, it was smallpox, which was running rampant amongst the men. The loss at Trois-Rivières meant that the American position in Montreal was now seriously threatened by that same British army that had just completely rolled over the American forces. Even before the attack, the situation in Montreal was tenuous. The town was now, at least temporarily, under the command of our old friend, Benedict Arnold, who had moved to the south to continue his recovery from the wounds suffered in Quebec. Arnold was extremely frustrated at the campaign in general, lamenting upon his arrival in April that the Army's struggles came as a result of the lack of support from Congress. Although he learned that there were 1,500 or so reinforcements waiting for the weather to improve so they could move north from Crown Point, he feared that it was going to be too little too late to meaningfully affect events. If the situation had been bad before Thompson's loss at Trois-Rivières, it was absolutely dire after it. It was clear to everybody that Canada was lost. Their positions were simply no longer tenable. By June 10th, Arnold was urging Sullivan to abandon Montreal and pull back out of Canada, in order that Sullivan would ultimately give. With the order given, Benedict Arnold quickly got to work, planning for the evacuation of Canada entirely. The escape route was going to take the men along the Richelieu River to the island of Île-à-Noix, a location that we last visited during the French and Indian War, where the French had withdrawn to following their abandonment of Crown Point. Now it would be the Americans' turn to pull back towards the island. About the only good news for Arnold is that the British were not really pressing their advantage following their victory. Despite them very clearly having both momentum and a decisive advantage, Carleton decided to play things cautiously. The British did continue to move south up the St. Lawrence, but at a slow enough pace that it bought the Americans time that they so critically needed. Not that Carleton really needed to use his military to force the issue. Conditions on Île-à-Noix were absolutely abysmal, with the official order to evacuate coming on June 17th. What met the men on the island were filthy conditions, where smallpox ran rampant. Despite their suffering, however, the fight was not over yet. Canada may have been lost, but Arnold and the Americans would still need to stop the British from advancing and cutting off New England. Now, Arnold would leave pretty quickly to head to New York for a conversation with the man who was actually in charge of the expedition, Philip Schuyler. Back on Île-à-Noix, command fell to John Sullivan, who was busy doing his best to deflect blame for the debacle in Canada off of himself. It was Sullivan who had asked Arnold to go speak with Schuyler. Now, I bring up Sullivan because he will not remain on Île-à-Noix for long, and indeed, we are going to see him resurface again in the very near future. As for that meeting between Schuyler and Arnold, really what it came down to was a discussion of what comes next. Schuyler was annoyed that Sullivan had only ordered the men to pull back to Île-à-Noix, and not further to Crown Point. The immediate issue is that Île-à-Noix risked being encircled by an aggressive British army, whereas Crown Point was a far more defensible position, where they could at least make a stand. Besides that, both Arnold and Schuyler believed that before the year was over, Carleton and Burgoyne would at least attempt an offensive against Crown Point and Ticonderoga. About the only good thing that Benedict Arnold could share with Schuyler is that the Americans probably had a little bit of time. We already know that Carleton was moving at an overly cautious pace, and expected that he would not risk an attack on Crown Point without an overwhelming show of force to back it up. Carleton's timidity and lack of interest in a bold stroke meant that the Americans may indeed have a brief window of time to prepare. Before the two men would separate, Schuyler let Arnold know one final bit of information: that his time commanding anything to do with Canada was at an end. With Schuyler out, it would be General Horatio Gates taking command over the Canadian front. An alumni of Braddock's March, Gates had quickly become a popular figure in New England, where Philip Schuyler was anything but. In what would become something of a personal battle between Gates and Schuyler, Congress was going to find themselves needing to deal with two strong personalities, both eager to make a name for themselves. This actually created a substantial amount of confusion, as Schuyler was not exactly fired. He remained in control over the Northern Department of the Army as a whole, while Gates was in command over the troops in Canada. Therefore, he was more technically replacing John Sullivan. Schuyler argued that as there were no longer troops in Canada, Gates really did not have an army to command, with Schuyler retaining control over New York. Eventually, Congress was forced to step in and mediate the matter, with Gates getting his army, but Schuyler seeing his rank upheld. I will also state, giving you guys all a little bit of foreshadowing, that Benedict Arnold's relationship with Horatio Gates will play a major role to decisions that Benedict Arnold would make in the future that make him, well, Benedict Arnold. Without much question, the main theater of the war in 1776 was going to be New York. However, Washington recognized that both Canada and the South were major secondary theaters of the conflict. With us having just covered Canada, we will now drop down to the South to see what is happening there before we move to New York next time. During the summer of 1776, a confluence of events in the southern states would help define what the war in the South would look like. If Thomas Jefferson was actively castigating Indian tribes in the Declaration, events around South Carolina would confirm the worst fears of that population. The job of trying to secure the southern theater of the war fell to Charles Lee of Virginia. He had made his way south earlier in 1776 and found that the region really was not prepared for a war that had already begun. Lee was facing a few problems. In the case of Williamsburg and Charleston, he found targets ripe for the British picking. For many in the South, the fear of a victory over one of these major targets is that it would be enough to encourage local Indian tribes and slaves that it might be a pretty good time to join in the fighting. Lee, as it turned out, had reason to be concerned over all of these things. In the weeks before the Declaration of Independence, the Cherokee tribes were indeed making plans for an offensive against the frontiers in the southern states. They were joined by other tribes further to the north, tribes such as the Delaware, Mohawk, Shawnee, and Ottawas, who were all eagerly looking at their opportunity to right some of the wrongs of the past. As the various tribes were busy making plans to strike against the Americans, the British were preparing their own strike against South Carolina. Charles Lee was right to be worried about the state of defenses in Charleston, and thinking it would be a target, because that is exactly what happened. The conflict would come on Sullivan's Island, off the coast of Charleston. The island had a long history already in Charleston, as it was the arrival location for huge numbers of slaves brought into North America. When South Carolina's governor, William Campbell, had fled the colony the year before, the island remained within the distance of the firing range of the British fleet just offshore. This meant that the British retained some measure of control over the island. For escaped slaves, hoping to jump over to the British, Sullivan's Island became the primary place for them to head, seeking the protection of those British guns. In December of 1775, a South Carolina militia company attempted to rid the island of the escaped slave population. Some were recaptured, Many were killed, and a small number managed to make it out to the protection of the British fleet. Sullivan's Island remained a logical landing spot for the British, should they wish to attempt to get a foothold in South Carolina and ultimately retake Charleston. Charleston was an alluring target for the British for a couple of reasons. It was the capital of South Carolina, had a large harbor for landing troops for a wide-scale invasion of the southern states, and finally, was one of the largest cities in all of North America. Charleston was the fourth largest city in the country, and with a population of 12,000 citizens, it was the largest city to the south of Philadelphia. Should the British recapture it, they could potentially deliver a devastating blow to the American war effort. With General Howe busy preparing for his landing in New York and Burgoyne advancing through Canada, Henry Clinton was going to be in charge of the Southern Theater. Clinton was operating with a few difficulties. They knew that, as of this time, capturing the city of Charleston was probably not going to happen. Reinforcements had been slow to reach Clinton, and now he was working on borrowed time. The plan was that, later in the campaign season, Clinton would move back to the north and join Howe for the landing in New York. His objectives in Charleston were accordingly smaller, therefore. What he did want to achieve before heading back north was simply to establish a foothold. To accomplish this, he needed to clear those American forces off of Sullivan's Island and capture the fort that they had built there. If Clinton could pull this off, he would be in control of the entrance to Charleston Bay. The initial plan was to land across from Sullivan's Island, and then the British forces would make their way across a shallow inlet at low tide. Upon landing on the 18th, however, it quickly became clear that this plan was not going to work, as that shallow inlet was not quite shallow enough. The water was just too deep. Clinton quickly regrouped, and on June 28th he commenced with Plan B. Use his fleet to just blast Sullivan's Island into submission. This is exactly what Clinton did, hurling over 10,000 rounds at the fort over the course of the 28th. The defenders on Sullivan's Island took refuge in a wooden fort that they had constructed. Now, normally, being on the receiving end of such a large British bombardment would lead to a pretty bad day. However, the South Carolinians had an ace up their sleeve. The fort that they were hunkering down in was built primarily of wood that was harvested from palmetto trees. Palmetto trees have a particularly spongy wood, which, in this specific instance, was absolutely perfect for withstanding a cannonade. The wood was able to absorb the impact from the attack without much of a problem, keeping the American defenders safe inside, if not a bit rattled from their experience. With the British blasting away to no real success, another problem quickly emerged for Henry Clinton. Well, the fort on the island was built from those spongy palmetto trees. Clinton's ships were most certainly not. When the Americans returned fire, Clinton's ships proved to be far more susceptible to damage from the cannons than was the fort. Now in a bad place, Clinton was left with few options. His ships were taking heavy damage, with at least 2 of them being lost, while he seemed incapable of inflicting a scratch on the American troops. With no other options available, Clinton withdrew. As the smoke cleared, the British were left with 115 dead, compared to just 7 Americans. The loss at Sullivan's Island was a blow to the British, but even more so was a huge boon to American morale. It also illustrated a critical point, one that George Washington himself would soon realize. Historian Woody Holton explains how the lessons that the British learned at Sullivan's Island in June of 1776 were really a reinforcement of the lessons that they had learned the previous June at Bunker Hill, a battle that Clinton was also at. The Americans were not going to win this war through huge engagements. but through stout defenses and the protection of fortified locations. There were a whole lot of hills in the United States, hills that the Americans needed to protect and the British needed to storm. British leadership, on the ground in North America anyway, was already worried about this grim reality the year before, and now Sullivan's Island had just reminded them of this formidable obstacle. Following Clinton's withdrawal, he would leave the South altogether and move north to join General Howe on the British landing in New York. It is also worth noting here that the South Carolina flag bears the mark of this battle. If you look at the flag, it features none other than the palmetto tree. Although, in interest of accuracy, it should be mentioned that this flag was adopted in 1861, when, that January, it was selected to replace the old flag known as the Moultrie flag, named after William Moultrie. Moultrie had been the commanding officer on Sullivan's Island when Clinton attacked, and later the fort on that island would come to bear his name. In January of 1861, South Carolina was looking for a new flag, and subsequently added the palmetto tree to it. Now, based on those dates, you might have figured out the reason why South Carolina was busy designing a new flag in January 1861. It is because a month earlier, they had decided to secede from the Union. In the aftermath of the victory over Clinton, the South Carolinians were feeling mighty pleased with themselves. As a reminder from a few minutes ago, while Clinton was busy learning about the properties of the palmetto tree, the Cherokee were joining in with other tribes to launch a full-scale attack along the frontiers. Following that meeting at the beginning of June, what would tip events over the edge was the Cherokee refusing to turn over a loyalist who was living with them. Under the command of Major Andrew Williamson, a group of 10 men met with the Cherokee and, after making an attempt at diplomacy, killed the entire group of Indians. As a result, the Cherokee began attacking frontier settlements throughout the South. These Indian groups were often joined by white loyalists, who were looking to take the fight to the Whigs. It should not come as much of a surprise that the Whigs were quick to blame the imperial government. This was nothing new, of course, nor was it completely incorrect. We have talked previously about attempts by British officials to bring the native tribes into the fight on their side. Ironically, as historian Woody Holton states, this had the effect of driving many loyalists to change their loyalties to the Patriot cause. The timing of this incident, too, had a lot to do with just how Americans reacted. All of this is happening at about the same time that Clinton was shelling Sullivan's Island. It was not a difficult jump for people to view the two events and assume that they were directly related. The Americans already knew that the British had been courting with the Indians and trying to get them to take up the fight. It was something that Jefferson mentioned in the Declaration. Now, that was exactly what was happening. These raids were not inconsequential either, as along the frontier some 60 Americans now lay dead as a result. It has been a while since we have really talked about Indian aggression along the frontier. We started this season with Pontiac's Rebellion, and before that we talked about the Pennsylvania and Virginia frontier during the French and Indian War. Recall back to those episodes the general reluctance from just about everybody for a more wide-scale attack. Now, however, the situation had dramatically changed. The Americans were not content with just sitting back and watching how the situation developed. Rather, what they had in mind was a campaign of vengeance. The stated goal was simple. They wanted to remove the Cherokee from lands east of the Mississippi. This was not an unpopular opinion either. Thomas Jefferson, upon learning of the attacks, fully agreed that the only solution was a full-scale invasion of Cherokee land, and a campaign to push them to the west of the Mississippi. The result of this was a campaign of utter destruction that spread throughout the frontiers, from Virginia to Georgia. 3 columns of men moved through the Indian lands and effectively led a scorched earth campaign, burning and destroying everything in their wake. Robert Parkinson, author of The Common Cause, Creating Race and Nation in the American Revolution, talks extensively about the timing of the events along the frontiers of the South and the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson had called out the British for attempting to start Indian insurrections along the frontier. And here, right as the Declaration was reaching that part of the country, was exactly what was happening. Combine this with the attempt by Clinton to land on Sullivan's Island, and you did not really need to be a conspiracy theorist to believe that the events were directly related. The carnage was complete and largely approved of. The press throughout the United States spent the months between July and October talking about the progress of the fight and painting those frontier farmers as being completely innocent victims. Regardless of the truth of this assertion, it had the desired effect. Critically, however, Indian violence was not enough by itself. There had been Indian violence before. That was nothing new. Just think of how many times on this podcast we have talked about the danger along the frontiers. What was important, however, was that this violence was being tied back to the British. That is where Clinton's actions and the impeccable timing of the Declaration came into play, as they helped to forge that connection. The press ran with it and helped fully develop this narrative. Alexander Cameron, who had been treating with the Cherokee on behalf of the British, suddenly found himself being painted as the ultimate villain. For the Americans fighting along the frontier, Cameron became one of their primary goals. They wanted him either dead or alive. By October, the brief Cherokee War of 1776 had come to an end. The treaties that were reached in the aftermath of the fighting saw millions of acres being given up by the Cherokee. They might not have been pushed west of the Mississippi, but they were giving up a massive amount of their traditional lands. Cherokee chief Dragging Canoe was so incensed by this that he and a dedicated group of warriors moved into the Tennessee Valley, where they would continue to fight, and the Americans would continue to attack. The Cherokee War had proven to be something of an unexpected game-changer. Americans had responded and attacked in a fashion that we have never really seen before. Recall the Cherokee Rebellion that we talked about in the first episodes of this season. There were battles, but Jeffrey Amherst won that war by depriving the Indians of weapons and ammunition. There were ugly moments, as we see in virtually every single Indian war. However, it was not an outright scorched earth plan. What happened in 1776 completely changed that dynamic and would force the native tribes to reconsider their position and how they were going to move forward. Men like John Stuart and Alexander Cameron had, for a while, sought Indian alliances, something which we have talked about before. But really what they had wanted was to ensure Indian neutrality. Following the Cherokee War, Stuart abruptly reversed course, and now did seek a more aggressive relationship that encouraged violent confrontation between the tribes and the Americans. Stuart began actively encouraging closer alliances between the tribes, arguing that they were far stronger together than separate. This had been something that Stuart had thus far avoided, recognizing the danger that united tribes could potentially pose to the British. Now, however, he reversed course, encouraging the tribes to unite for the sake of protecting their lands from the Americans. The problem was that the tribes themselves were now looking at a vastly changed landscape. The Americans had acted far more aggressively than anybody would have guessed from past encounters. Likewise, none of the tribes had failed to recognize that while the Americans were on their campaign, the British Army never stepped in to intervene or help slow up the American forces. The other tribes were, for good reason, suddenly very reluctant to get involved and find themselves in the same position as the now defeated Cherokee. The Cherokee War was another event that would help to galvanize the Americans from north to south. It was another example of the evil actions of the British, with Stuart and Cameron standing front and center as the villains of the story. It also helped to establish a narrative for the Americans moving forward. Tribes all along the frontier could not fail to see the brutality that the Americans conducted their campaign with. It stood as a warning to all of them that the game had changed, and that a new chapter was just beginning. Tribes who may have been thinking about getting involved with the British and launching attacks on American positions and settlements were going to need to think very carefully about the ramifications that came with that decision. These attitudes by the Americans towards the native tribes would carry on long beyond the end of the war. This will end up helping to define that relationship between the Indian tribes and the United States well into our future. Next time, with us now caught up on the secondary theaters of the war in Canada and in the South, our attention turns towards the primary theater in 1776, New York. When we return, we will watch as Washington and company prepare for that inevitable engagement with William Howe and the British. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as the British launch their attack on New York.